The accent, the act, the audacity. Good evening, everyone. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. Well, after Sunday's commentary about former Vice President and failed 2024 Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris and her absolute bizarre appearance on the Win with Black Women podcast, where she delivered what sounded less like a coherent political discussion and more like a motivational seminar hosted at 2 a.m. in an airport Marriott conference room, I decided to go back in time. And folks, I made a terrible mistake because I spent hours reviewing old Kamala Harris press conferences, campaign rallies, interviews, speeches, town halls, and cable news appearances from the past several years. And after watching all of it, I honestly don't know whether I was watching a politician or a Broadway audition, because one thing became painfully obvious over and over and over again. Kamala Harris changes her speaking style, vocal tone, personality, and even what sounded like her accent depending on the audience sitting in front of her. One rally, she sounded like a Californian prosecutor. A next rally, she sounded like a Southern Baptist preacher. Then suddenly, she's on another stage talking like she just stepped onto a spoken word poetry slam in Brooklyn. And then 5 minutes later, honestly, it was exhausting. Now let's be clear. Kamala Harris is an Indian Jamaican American woman. This is her heritage. Her mother was from India and her father was from Jamaica. That is factual. But what became increasingly noticeable throughout her political career was the repeated tendency to seamlessly reinvent herself depending on which audience she was wanted to approve in that moment. And Americans notice it. A lot of Americans notice it because authenticity matters. People can disagree politically and still respect authenticity, but when voters feel somebody is constantly performing, constantly shape-shifting, constantly adjusting their identity depending on the room, trust disappears, and that, in my opinion, became one of Kamala Harris's biggest political problems, not because of her race, not because of her background, but because so many Americans felt they never actually knew who she actually was. You know, one of my favorite Kamala Harris moments, and I say favorite sarcastically, was when she famously said, "You think you could just fall out of a coconut tree?" And then she started laughing uncontrollably while explaining, "You exist in the context of all in which you live and then what became before you." What does that even mean? Seriously, what does it mean? Because Democrats spent years telling Americans that Kamala Harris was some kind of historic intellectual powerhouse. The media treated her like she was a combination of Abraham Lincoln, Oprah Winfrey, and Einstein. And then she would get on stage and start speaking in riddles that sounded like fortune cookies written by exhausted college professors. And remember this, gem? What can be unburdened by what has been? She repeated that line so many times, I'm convinced Democrats started pretending to understand it just to avoid embarrassment. At one point, I think reporters were afraid to ask her what it meant because they didn't want to admit they had absolutely no clue what she was talking about. And yet, the media kept insisting she was brilliant. No. What Americans saw was somebody desperately trying to sound profound instead of speaking plainly. And this is where Democrats made a catastrophic mistake. Instead of addressing real issues Americans were facing every day, like inflation, housing costs, grocery prices, energy prices, border security, violent crimes, they spent years over identity politics and celebrity-style political branding. And Kamala Harris became the perfect symbol of that strategy. Everything was about image. Everything was about symbolism. Everything was historic. But what did Americans actually get? Did groceries become cheaper? No. Did rent become more affordable? No. Did energy prices improve? No. Did Americans suddenly feel safer? Absolutely not. Instead, Americans were told repeatedly that if the economy was strong, while families were standing in supermarkets wondering why eggs were suddenly costing more than a small car payment. And every time Americans complained about prices, what did Democrats do? Blame Donald Trump. That was always the answer. Inflation? Trump. Border problems? Trump. Gas prices? Trump. Bad weather? Probably Trump too. At some point, Democrats sounded less like leaders and more like people trapped in a toxic relationship who refuses to take responsibility for anything. And meanwhile, Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, often appeared completely disconnected from everyday Americans. There were moments where reporters would ask serious questions and she would respond with nervous laughter. And that became another defining feature of her public image. The laugh. That laugh. The laugh that sounded like somebody was trying to stall for time during a high school book report they forgot to prepare for. And let me say something else that Democrats in Washington and corporate media still refuse to understand. As a Gen Z American, yes, I'm willing to temporarily pay more at the gas pump or grocery stores if that means the United States is finally confronting a regime that has spent decades funding terrorism, destabilizing the Middle East, threatening American allies, and chanting death to America. Because while Democrats and media commentators continue calling President Trump dangerous and accusing him of starting what they dramatically labeled as war of choice with Iran, many of Americans look at it very differently. Many Americans believe strength prevents larger wars. Many Americans believe peace through deterrence actually works. And many of Americans are tired of watching weak foreign policy and bold hostile regimes around the world. What's truly astonishing is hearing Democrats suddenly pretend to care about higher gasoline prices now, when Americans suffered through some of the most highest fuel prices in modern history during the so-called Biden-Harris administration. Let's not rewrite history. Americans remember gas prices climbing above $5 per gallon in parts of the country. Americans remember inflation crushing working families. Americans remember grocery bills skyrocketing while Washington elites insisted economy was supposedly strong, and meanwhile, billions upon billions of dollars flowed internationally while Americans here at home struggled just to afford basic necessities. So spare us the lecture now, because the same political party warning Americans about temporary economic sacrifice today spent years defending policies already drained American financially while projecting weakness overseas. And whether people agree or disagree with President Trump's approach towards Iran, one thing is undeniable. The world does not become safer when violent extremist regimes believe the United States lacks the courage to confront them. And then came Win with Black Women podcast appearance, which honestly felt like a political theater at the absolute peak. Again, suddenly the tone changed, the cadence changed, the delivery changed, and you sit there wondering, who exactly is she performing for? Because Americans don't need politicians pretending to be something they're not. And if you're proud of your heritage, great. You should be. I'm a Haitian, Italian, Irish American. I don't pretend something else depending on the audience sitting in front of me. And most Americans respect people who are comfortable in their own identity. But voters become skeptical when politicians appear to constantly modify themselves for political convenience. That's not authenticity, that's marketing. And Americans are becoming increasingly tired of political marketing campaigns distinguished as leadership. But honestly, Kamala Harris wasn't the disease, she was the symptom. The modern Democratic Party creates this environment, an environment where presentation matters more than policy, where slogan matters more than solution, where hashtags matter more than results, and where media appearance becomes more important than governing. Because for years, Democrats and corporate media outlets tried to convince Americans that questioning Kamala Harris somehow made you a terrible person. No, Americans questioned her because they were watching her speak. They were watching her inconsistencies. They were watching the awkward interviews. They were watching the consistent shifting political identity. And eventually, people stopped buying the act. And perhaps the most incredible part of all of this is that after the 2024 election loss, Democrats still didn't seem to learn anything. Instead of reflecting on why Americans rejected their message, many Democrats simply blamed voters. Again, that seems to be the reoccurring theme. If voters disagree with Democrats, voters must be the problem, not the policies, not the messaging, not the economic conditions, not the leadership failure. Nope, it was always somebody else's fault. Look, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, or politically exhausted altogether, most Americans want something very simple from a leader. Be real, be honest, be authentic, and above all, stop talking to Americans like we're stupid, because Americans can tell when somebody is performing. They can tell when politicians suddenly change personalities depending on the room they're walking into, and they can definitely tell when politicians spend more time rehearsing slogans than solving problems. Which brings me to my final thought. Honestly, the best political strategy for Kamala Harris at this point may simply be quietly fading from the national spotlight, because after years of speeches, interviews, world salads, awkward laughter, identity performances, and media protection, Americans already made their decision, and no amount of coconut treat speeches are going to change that. I'm Haley Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. Good night, and remember, being unburdened by what has been still doesn't explain what on earth she was talking about.